last but of course no means least, the final session of the day will be another roundtable discussion. And what we'll be doing is focusing on utilising technology to incorporate the patient voice in clinical trials. Where do we go next? So joining us on the roundtable to share their insights are Christina Dejuan, who's Global Clinical Sciences and Operations Innovation Lead for UCB, Lisa Schaaf, Clinical Program Leader for Roche, Richard Dearden, Head of AI Digital Health, AstraZeneca, and Paul Derulac, Digital Transformation Lead, Genentech. And then finally, the session moderator, Amy Apostolaris, Global Head of Digital Clinical Trial Solutions for Medocity. So just before we start, just a reminder to the attendees, you've joined in listen-only mode. There are various systems with areas within the system that I'd encourage you to use. So, of course, towards the back end of the session, like the previous ones, there'll be an opportunity to ask the panel questions. Just put the questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand side, and we will select those towards the end of the session. So that's it from me, really. I think I'd just like to hand over to Amy, and perhaps, Amy, if you could start by maybe just giving a quick introduction to who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Really appreciate you joining us today, and a very exciting topic. We are going to be talking about utilizing technology to incorporate the patient voice in clinical trials, and what does the future hold? Where do we go next? A little bit about myself. I have a little over 25 years of experience in healthcare, starting with the pharma industry and also working in clinical research and disease management. And most recently joined Medocity as Global Head of Digital Clinical Trials, which essentially means I oversee the use of our technology in conducting clinical research as well as real-world evidence generation. A bit of a background on Medocity. We are a digital health technology company which provides enterprise solutions as well as fit-for-purpose solutions, specifically for clinical research. That includes ePro, eCOA, eConsent, and in addition, the ability to integrate multiple data sources from the front end, including EMR, APCD data, as well as on the back end to integrate with EDC, CTMS, and during a clinical trial. What differentiates our platform is the ability for patients to receive intuitive information about their health during a clinical study, and for sites and sponsors to essentially, in real time, know what's going on in the clinical trial. I want to show you a diagram, which essentially is what I want to kick off during our discussion as to how the connected ecosystem works with Medocity's platform. And this is what we're going to be talking about throughout the discussion, among other things. Oh, that was not what I wanted to do. Apologies for that. Let's see if we can do this quickly. Okay, so essentially you can see here the connected ecosystem. When you have the entire ecosystem with the ability to include data from all perspectives, incorporating patient data, as well as connected devices, information coming from the patient side, but then at the same time being able to export that data across the continuum for clinical and commercial purposes. On the right side here, the ability for sites, investigators to see that data in real time and respond and resolve whether there are alerts, medication adherence issues, symptoms, or otherwise, and at the same time for sponsors and monitors to review in real time again and make early decisions about the clinical study and about how the progress is going. So I'll stop sharing for a second, and I think most importantly for today, I would like to allow the panel to introduce themselves and give a little bit of background about each of your experiences as well. I'd like to start with Christina. Christina, would you please introduce yourself?
Hi, hello. Sorry, my connection is really bad, so just let me know if it gets cut off. So I'm one of the innovation leads at the ClinOps team within UCB. So part of our work is to incorporate DCT solutions and really just to see what digital solutions can help our patients. Really, UCB is a very patient-focused company. So this is our mission, if you like.
Thank you, Christina. And Paul?
Hi, my name is Paul Derulak. I'm with Genentech, part of the digital transformation and innovation initiatives primarily focused on supply chain. However, we have been recently, over the past 2 years, highly focused on developing a platform that has implications both across the commercial supply chain as well as the clinical supply chain and clinical trial space. So I'm probably the outlier here in that I've spent most of my career within supply chain. I'm relatively new to pharmaceuticals, so bringing a bit of an outside view, and spent the last 7 years in the IoT space.
Thank you, Paul, and looking forward to your perspective. I think that would be very interesting, considering you're coming from the supply chain side. And Lisa.
So thanks, Amy. So hi, I'm Lisa. I've been in the industry now for, dare I say, coming up to 30 years, both in the CRO and the pharma side of things in lots of different therapeutic areas. I'm now concentrating in neurosciences and mainly in the area of autism. I've been at Roche for 10 years, and we actually started really looking into the patient-centric approach as we moved into autism about 8 years ago, because it's very much an area that doesn't lend itself to the traditional clinical trials. So more of that will actually come out as we have our panel session. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And Richard.
So, hi, I'm Richard Dearden, and I'm working in digital health in AstraZeneca. And I've been in pharma for 3 years, primarily working on kind of study design, and in particular on bringing patient centricity into study design. So we've been looking at, what makes a study difficult for patients to be a part of, basically doing a lot of listening to the patients about how studies could be better for them. And my background, I'm a computer scientist, AI and robotics guy by training. So I've worked a lot in sort of robotics and smart devices, and so come at IoT from that direction as well.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think everyone has some very, very relevant experience, and I'd love to kick off our discussion now. One of the things that we've been hearing since the pandemic has been the term decentralized clinical trial. And one of the questions I've always had is, from everyone's perspective, whether it's the sponsor or the patient or the investigator or the technology company, what does that really mean? And I'm going to put up, bear with me as I try to share my screen. I'm going to put up another slide that actually can give us a little bit of guidance here, because the decentralized clinical trial can mean something for every stakeholder and differently as well. As you can see here, there are a number of things that I've pulled together doing a survey across these stakeholders and seeing what exactly a decentralized clinical trial means. And as we know, for a patient, it's a pretty critical, although maybe not using that term, but it's a pretty critical characteristic for a clinical trial. But if I can start off and ask the question, Lisa, how do you define a decentralized clinical trial, and what do you think it means in terms of patients?
So thanks, Amy. So we use two terms, decentralized clinical trial and hybrid clinical trial, certainly within Roche. So I work primarily in what we're calling a hybrid. So we're not in the full model that you're actually showing here. The reason for that is we're very much at the early stage of research. So I kind of work in the phase 1 and the phase 2. So it's first time into man. And then obviously first time, we actually call them participants rather than patients. And that again goes to support what you're terming the patient-centric approach here. Because we're looking at their participants, so we're partnering with them in their clinical trial journey. We're not actually treating them as patients or subjects in the study. So we're actually changing our whole terminology as we go across this area. So for us, where we are, so we started working about 8 years ago in this area, and we've kind of grown that journey. In the world of autism, a lot of the scales and assessments that have traditionally been used have been very much from the caregiver approach rather than the actual participant. So we're actually been using technology to really find some ways where we can actually get the participant's voice themselves, either directly or indirectly, rather than by the caregiver. So we've brought a lot of technology in, and we've brought apps where the participant themselves is actually then giving feedback, and that we've gamified a lot of the scales, so they're actually doing it directly. So we're not getting information secondhand on somebody's subjective view of what the participant themselves are actually doing in a clinical trial. So we've listened as much as we can, and where we can, we've made it practical.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I like the way you brought in the caregiver as well, because in many clinical trials, the caregiver is part of the patient's journey, whether it is during a clinical study or outside. Any thoughts on that, Christina? What is your view? I'm hoping you can hear me. What is your view of a decentralized clinical trial? How would you define it from your perspective?
From my perspective, it's a trial that has. Can you hear me? Okay, really, my Wi-Fi is terrible.
Great. Yeah.
Yes. So it's a trial that either has virtual components that would allow the patients to participate in the trial, even though they don't necessarily live near a site. So this is really one of our aims. It's really how do we make it easier to reach out to other patients, or to patients that might need caregivers with them, as you mentioned. So this is the idea, really, to bring the trials to the patient's home and to come up with new measurements or new ways of collecting data as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of what I've heard as well, is kind of bringing trials to patients. And I think, Richard, you mentioned that you had done some outreach to patients as well, and would love to hear your perspective on that.
So we've spent the last year or so surveying patients on all sorts of aspects of trials, trying to understand what are the things that make a trial difficult for patients and so on. And and some of the things that have come out of that is that certainly traveling into the clinic to do a visit for a trial is a big piece of burden for a patient. And so the more that we can move stuff into patients, into their homes and make that easier for them, I think that's we've seen from the survey that the patients are very keen on that. I think the challenge in some sense is doing it in a way that accommodates all the different needs of different patients in different age groups, different cultures, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think for me that's the really interesting thing in a sense is how do you not just make your trial decentralized, but actually just make it generally better for the patients when not every patient may have the same needs and wants from a trial. I think lots of patients, for example, are very keen on access to healthcare professionals as one of the benefits of being on a trial. And so if you kind of make that all at a distance, then they don't see that benefit that they really wanted.
Right. Yeah. And how do you think technology fits into this? Richard, you're mentioning, making it easy for the patient, and how do you see technology fitting in?
So, I mean, we certainly see a real role for for apps on phones and other devices. One of the things we asked the patients was if you were filling out patient-recorded outcomes questionnaires about the trial, how would you prefer those to be delivered? And right across the age range of patients we surveyed, we saw that there was a real preference for digital, doing that digitally rather than kind of paper, filling them in on paper, and also in being able to do it on their own device rather than going into the clinic and using a device there. So definitely those kinds of things. I think we're also very interested in collecting data using digital devices, and I think the challenges there we'll probably talk about later on, but wearables and things like that have a real role to play, I think, in the future.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I think the biggest impact, in a sense, is being able to just ask patients on their own devices. And I think that on their own devices is actually kind of critical in many ways, because there's a very strong preference we see for that over, we'll give you a device that you have to use.
Yeah. I agree with a lot of what you're saying. And you know, at Medocity, we've done some surveys with patients as well. And I think one of the most important thing is what you described as flexibility. And I've underscored that here, if you can see, if the audience can see the screen. But also what Christina mentioned is having, patients having the ability to be participating in a clinical study where they are. So it's flexibility and, the ability to engage in a clinical trial where they are, and utilizing technology to do that. I think for the most part, the easier a technology is to use, and whether it's your own device or a connected device, the more apt a patient is to continue to stay on the study, even prior to that, even determine or make the decision to enroll in the study. So now that we've pretty much level set the quote unquote decentralized clinical trial, I thought I would go into a dialogue on how you've each used technology in your clinical trial development activities. And perhaps, Lisa, I don't mean to start off with you again, but I know you talked a little bit about the technology that you're using to support the studies currently. But using that technology, describe how you keep the patient at the center. How are you ensuring that the patient is still at the center?
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. So one of the big things we're doing, as I mentioned, is we're actually looking at a hybrid model. So we do actually have a bit of a combination. We do have some assessments which really do, for medical reasons, have to actually take place at site. But we are utilising technology to shift as much as we can away from site. And we also have an option for some subjects, as Richard actually just mentioned, some of our participants actually prefer to be on site rather than be at home. So we have a couple of our assessments where our participants can actually choose to either stay on site and have these assessments done on site, or they can choose to go home and actually have them done at home. And they're done by a central rating telemedicine route. So where they're coming from doesn't make any difference, because they're having a video call via telemedicine with a third party. So regardless of where the data is coming from, it's still going to be a consistent level. But the big ones we're mentioning is we're here to talk about digital devices. So we, as I mentioned, we were looking at ways where our participants can actually give over information, be it passively or directly, in various forms. So we've actually built an app which has modified and evolved many times over the last probably 5 years when we first brought it out, where we've gamified some of their interactions. So it measures the way that they're thinking and acting, whether they're prepared to work together as a team with the computer, as it were, or whether they're kind of all out for themselves and just want to get, in this particular game, get as much treasure as they can. So we have 4 or 5 different kind of games and quizzes and things that they can do, which actually to them will just feel like a bit of interaction, a bit of fun, but actually gives us a huge volume of data behind. So we have facial recognition and things like that. And can they recognize smiles versus sads versus frowning versus angry faces, which obviously, as you can imagine, in a population that doesn't immediately recognize that in a real person, actually be able to measure that and have it as a game means, again, we're getting it directly from our participants rather than the caregiver saying, oh, when we went shopping, they didn't recognize somebody was getting really angry. We don't need to get that kind of third-party feedback. We're actually getting it now directly from the participants. We're also using smartwatches and what was called room and people beacons. So with room beacons, we have beacons in bedrooms and in living rooms and kitchens. So we call them quite social and non-social areas. So we can actually measure whether our participants, for example, are actually spending more time with their family, which again is not a traditional trait of somebody with autism. So we're actually measuring whether they're actually feeling more social for a particular day or less social, and they're maybe sitting in their room playing on the computer. But again, these things can't, thinking about the security side of things, they can't be looped back. We can't identify where the subjects are. We're literally, it's just Bluetooth signals and then it's going up. So it's just their vicinity to the beacons, and to the people beacons will be in family members' pockets or around their necks or things on a lanyard. And then we brought in smart mats recently as well. So we can measure their quality of sleep, whether there's somebody's tossing and turning all night, as an example. or whether they're actually getting a really good night's sleep. Because again, within autism, sleep's something that a lot of people are really, really struggling with. So we're using technology where we can to actually get data almost directly from our participants, as mentioned, rather than, somebody else's viewpoint on what they think their child or the person they're caring for is actually going through.
Wow, that's a pretty. I have to hear an echo, but that's great what you're doing, and I'm curious with all these devices that you're utilizing, how are you connecting them and collecting the data? And
so everything is going up through Wi-Fi. So the Bluetooth devices tag into each other, and then everything uploads via the Wi-Fi system into the cloud, and then we collect from the cloud.
Mm-hmm. And are these observational studies, or is there a therapy?
No, we did do a 2-year observational study for first, and now we're actually doing it in our drug studies.
Okay. Quick question, because I'm going to segue to Paul for a moment, but how do you incorporate your drug management into the study? Is it
so at the moment that is actually part of our site visits, purely because we do other assessments on the days that the drug actually needs to be shipped out. So if they weren't coincided, then we'd actually courier the medication out to the participants.
Okay. I'm going to segue to you, Paul, because I think the reason why I brought up the drug management is because of your tool and the ability to, kind of manage drug use and what's happening, where it's going, who's using it, et cetera.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about how that technology could be utilized perhaps in a clinical study?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And at Genentech, we're definitely heavily involved in the traditional applications that are emerging from a clinical trial standpoint in terms of wearables and patient apps and program tracking along those lines. Our group right now is focused on developing a platform that I would say complements those existing platforms and technologies, and maybe even perhaps operates more in the background, but we think that there is a definite benefit as we move into this, COVID-driven decentralized clinical trial. Direct patient delivery has accelerated definitely over the last 3 years, and we're looking at this platform as a way to meet that. And really what we're doing fundamentally is tracking condition, location, and our ambition is consumption of product at the unit level. So what's the condition of product whilst it's in a possession of a patient? Obviously, we lose a lot of control when we're outside of a clinical setting. And so we're looking at this as an opportunity to put another layer of surety around whether product is being brought to the right temperature, if it's temperature controlled, or are there excursions that are happening within a patient environment versus a clinical environment. So we're looking at this as an opportunity to build a level of surety in, and we're also, when we look at kind of some of the objectives you've put up, Amy, in terms of decentralized trials, real-time communication, improved data collection. Can we facilitate that? In some cases, that may be a challenge. And so this is also, a communication platform, potentially both directions. So we basically are looking at, a background level of communication around product location, product condition, and communication, another layer of communication in terms of how that product is being consumed.
Yeah, very interesting, and I think very useful for not only a clinical trial, but of course on the commercial side as well. I know if there's obviously a drug that is Schedule 2, that's important to know where that drug is going and how it's being used. Richard, any thoughts on some of what we've been discussing and how you've been using technology?
So actually, I was curious at listening to Paul. I was kind of interested in what the feedback is from the patients about the direct-to-patient delivery, because I think one of the things we discovered was that there was interest in that, but not necessarily just everything that way. So I think the patients were very keen to at least initially be talking to a clinician and being sure that they're doing the dosing correctly and things like that. The other thing I was going to ask about was sort of privacy issues. If you're tracking the location of the medication, does that bring some issues around kind of patients and giving out information about where they are that they may not feel that they need to be sharing with the trial that they're on?
Yeah.
So I would qualify that we're very much on the front end of this. Patient privacy is front and center in terms of what we're thinking about, and it comes into play more so on the commercial side than it does on the clinical side, because there is a certain degree of consent that's already granted and implied in a clinical trial that you're not necessarily getting on a commercial side. So patient privacy in terms of what data that what are we collecting and what are we not collecting? How do we differentiate that? How do we determine and parse out the data that we shouldn't have or don't want to have, and keep the data that we do? And a lot of this has to do, again, with frictionless, seamless communication, autonomous. How do we limit or eliminate steps that a patient would have to take to make this work? Right. So we're trying to make this as autonomous and frictionless as possible, and the convenience and ease of use, Amy, that's in your slide in the center there is really a focal point for us. But I'm not going to say that we've completely solved the patient privacy question and the data collection question, and we're very much on the pioneering edge of this.
Right. Yeah. No, we've had some similar ones, which is why I asked. Looking at, we had some work on detecting adverse events in trials, and it turned out that location data for the particular trial was quite useful because we could tell whether the patients were in the hospital or not. And so we were keen to kind of get location data from their phones or whatever, so that we could see whether they'd gone to the hospital. But obviously, there's a huge privacy issue there. And in the end, I think, we were looking at solutions where some of the processing was done on the device, so that in fact that location data was only ever sent to the to the trial team if there was, if the patient was in identified locations, in this case the hospitals. So no, I think there is a big challenge around that, and I think it's a very interesting area with, as we can collect more data and, from digital devices and from wearables and things, I'm sure we're all aware of the Fitbit issues with detecting things that people were very much not interested in sharing in terms of activity tracking, and obviously that again is something that we've got to make sure that we address those things if we're going to roll these things out. So.
Yeah,
we're actually looking for analogies in that space, kind of outside the industry as well. So if you look at connected cars, all of our cars are much smarter than they used to be, and they're directly connected. But there is technology in there where cars won't track a driver until 10 minutes after the car started, so that you don't know where the car actually originated from, and you don't know where the driver lives. Can we take some of that practice and bring that here in terms of parsing out data? So there's some things that we're looking at outside the industry as well.
Wow. Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Christina, do you have any thoughts on, in general, what we're talking about in terms of connecting patients and drug management, and also how you're utilizing technology in the studies you've been working on recently?
Yeah, so in terms of the direct-to-patient, drug shipments, I think there has been some instances during COVID times, but I wasn't involved, so I can't really give you a deep answer. In terms of how we utilize technology, we're utilizing technology in many different ways, not just on a DCT, if you like, decentralized trial, and how we are communicating with patients, or how much we can get them involved thanks to technology, but also actually we're looking at the therapeutic area of each of the patients and realizing that there are some digital solutions that actually will be beneficial, not just for the trial, but overall for the drug development for that therapeutic area. Let me explain myself. By sometimes collecting new data sources or continuous data, we might actually be able to come up with new endpoints, right? Potentially digital endpoints. So we're not just favoring the patients that are on that trial, but we are looking at how do we actually improve the landscape of the disease for these patients, right? So this is really important. And this is why one of the points where I think the industry, we need to get together in order to make this work. So yeah, we use e-consent or telemedicine, but then again, we are looking at what is the real problem for these patients. Is it really, that they're itching or that they're scratching? What is the technology out there to help them monitor, and how is that going to change the way we develop drugs and the kind of drugs we develop? Yeah.
Just a follow-up question to what you're saying, Christine, and this is for the whole panel. How are you integrating, if you are, other data sources into your clinical studies? And do you find that as being helpful, whether it is, of course, electronic medical records or other data that is part of a clinical trial, whether it's lab data or even, again, aggregated data or other data that gives you the insights from the patients so that you can make decisions on the clinical study design and as well any changes in the clinical protocol design throughout. Are any of you utilizing outside sources to bring into your cloud, and how are you doing that? Richard, Lisa?
Well, I can go first if you so we have. I think this is something that's very much study dependent. So for example, there are some studies that are effectively registry studies, for example, where we're using electronic health records to try and to provide the data that's needed for the trial. I think the really interesting thing about those from a patient, or about at least a couple of examples in AstraZeneca from a patient perspective, is we've done some where we have tried to completely match the cadence of the trial and what the patient on the trial would experience to what a normal patient with that disease would have anyway. So if they would be seeing their healthcare professional every, let's say, 3 months anyway, then we've basically set up the cadence of the visits to match that. And the idea is to essentially so use the standard of care arm of the trial is literally all just from the registry. So that's all just from records that would be kept about those patients anyway. And then the active arm, obviously, we have to give them the actual product. But other than that, it's completely matched. But I think I can't think of a good example where it's really digital devices and things like that, but certainly in terms of...
I think you kind of brought me to what I was going to ask in terms of using that type of data for synthetic arms in clinical studies where you're, perhaps it's a pediatric trial where you don't want to really, put children through the trial necessarily, but you have, this arm that is synthetic, but it's based on the records that are out there that helps you understand the patient, so that you don't have to, go through that with the placebo arm, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's some fantastic opportunities out there. I mean, there's a Transcelerate project, for example, specifically on reusing placebo arm data for other trials, which I think is a fantastic initiative. It's very hard to do in practice at the moment, but if we can get it to work, I think there's some real opportunities there to, there's a huge advantage for trials if we can do those kinds of things in terms of, the fact that that many fewer of your patients are on the placebo arm is great. And from a patient experience point of view, that's really important, right? Nothing drives patients opinion of trials down weren't more than that point halfway through when they think, I think I might be on the placebo arm. I'm not seeing any benefit here. Why am I still putting up with this, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things like that that I think are tremendous. And I mean, while we're on the subject of Transcelerate projects, I mean, there's also this patient, what is it, SPFQ, Study Participant Feedback Questionnaire thing, which they've just brought out, which I think is another great way we're getting patient voice into our studies. And we're working hard in AstraZeneca, for example, to incorporate that into the digital platforms so that it's easy for the patients to fill out as part of the trial experience. I think the challenge with things like that is then, where do they fit into the rest of the structure of the trial, right? What is that data really for? And, is there an endpoint associated with it? How do we justify collecting it? And particularly because it does produce more burden for patients. How do you then show the value of something which, is another questionnaire to be filled out, another piece of work to do. So,
interestingly enough, a way to use that, patient feedback questionnaire or to get the patient's input on a protocol design, what we've been doing at Medocity is at the initial stages, when the patient is consenting, before the protocol has been finalized, if there's a point where there's a qualification or early engagement step, the patient is given a questionnaire and it's then combined across the patients who have been consenting and interested in the trial, and then you can get an idea of whether the patient of what the patient's input is. And also during the study, there are questionnaires and feedback surveys that can be done during a study. So there are ways to incorporate that. Again, utilizing that data and being able to compile it and make early decisions or interim decisions could be a challenge. But there are ways to do that with the platform. I'm happy to talk about it further with you. Well, let's talk about some of these challenges that we're seeing with technology and any limitations. I know we talked earlier about privacy. Let's talk about regulatory hurdles. Richard, I'm going to go back to you because I think when we last spoke, that was an area that we thought, there are some regulatory hurdles that we are needing to overcome still, even 2 years into the quote-unquote pandemic and ongoing. So just curious, what are some of the regulatory hurdles that you're seeing?
I think, obviously, using new devices means new endpoints for studies, right? We're going to be measuring the effectiveness of our drugs differently. And I think, one of the big challenges is how do you get those accepted by the regulators, right? And if you want to show, so for example, we've done some work looking at wearable devices as alternatives for things like 6-minute walk tests or cycloergometry, exercise measurements. And it's really challenging, right? I mean, you need to effectively show that you could, from a data science point of view, that you can predict what the score would have been on that cycloergometry test from the Fitbit data or whatever it is that you're collecting. And that's a very challenging thing to show, that you can do it with sufficient reliability that you could take it to the regulator and they'll accept that data. So I think that's, for me, that's certainly one of the really big ones. And obviously, whatever you get certified, you may have to worry about different versions of the device and different versions of the firmware on the device, and there's all sorts of other kind of places where you just need to give it some thought and to be very careful about it.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know what other perspectives the rest of the panel.
Yeah, I would love to hear. Christina, I know you're in Spain. How are the regulations in the EU with regard to utilizing digital platforms or other technology for collecting data?
Yeah, so I was in the UK up until about 2 weeks ago, but it's the same, really. Well, not the same, but it's, the regulations still stand for medical devices and things like this up until June, I think, next year. Yes, precisely. Some of the regulatory barriers would be, how do you actually get a digital endpoint to become a primary endpoint in a study? This is why as I mentioned earlier, important to get together. Importing, exporting of devices as well. Is it a medical device? Is it a commercial device? Can I use it in the trial? Can I not use it? Honestly, the Q&A and regulatory teams have very hard work. It's extremely complicated, and suddenly each country, then they decide to keep it, in customs. Seriously, it's problematic. But I think particularly going through different continents. Yeah.
So if I may ask you, can you share a little bit about, the privacy requirements and any changes that you're hopefully addressing, or anything that you can share in terms of privacy in the EU specifically? I know countries differ in terms of their requirements.
I think so. The laws would be similar, right? They would be at a European level, but then each country, they have their own points of view about things. Okay, can I take a nurse to your home? Yes, no. Can this person perform this procedure? But the real regulation about privacy, I couldn't comment on, because that's really not my speciality. There are huge teams just focus on that, because it's very, very complex.
Are there other challenges or limitations that you're seeing other than regulatory and privacy from your experience?
In technology, yes. So I think data integration is one of them. Then, the patients, are they going to use them? The technologies, are they not going to use them? So it's really important to get the feedback throughout the study. What challenges? I guess cost could be one challenge as well in some things. How do you justify the extra cost right now? Or even within pharma, I mean, we work in innovation, and maybe we work in startups, and we understand risk and we understand failure, but clinical teams don't, right? Because if not because they don't want to, but because if you do something wrong, the consequences are so big. So I think that culture, that change in culture as well is very important. In UCB, the teams are great, to be honestly, compared to other places that I've worked, and everybody's quite innovative. But you might find sometimes in other places, people are more, there is no room for failure, if you like. Whereas with testing solutions, in the innovation teams, we are testing with as much information as we have, but ultimately it's like a trial as well. So that cultural thing, it's a thing as well. Or using vendors. I mean, there is so many barriers. I can be here half an hour, but it's really exciting, and it's very nice to see how the industry, and thanks to COVID, I guess this is just becoming a daily topic of conversation. It's very nice to see how the industry is going that way. And a few years ago, there were only a few open-minded team members, and now it can be at the company higher level. So it's really nice to see the change over the last few years.
Yeah,
so it's getting better, really. And all the research initiatives are very helpful. Transcelerate, DTRA, all of these things, they're really, really useful, and we're doing amazing things as well. Yeah,
that's great. I want to just ask one last question before my final question. The data quality, any thoughts on how utilizing technology is better data quality? Is there a gap?
So I can jump in there first. I think it depends on what it is that your technology is, because certainly we're getting really, really good data quality out, but we're also getting a huge volume of data quantity out as well from some of our apps. So it's actually feeding through the quantity to get to exactly what we need. And I think our irony is that we've actually had our participants being a lot more interactive and engaged, because they've got things that they can actually give over and do themselves. that we're actually getting a much, much higher level of interaction than we ever thought, so we're just kind of like looking at the 90% mark when we were estimating kind of 50-60% mark. So the volume of data coming in is huge, as well as actually being a really, really good quality. So I think certainly from our side, we underestimated the volume of man hours it would actually take to process the data that's actually coming in.
Yeah.
But that's a good sign.
That is a good sign. That is a good sign. Well, let me ask the final question. I know we probably have less than 5 minutes, and then we go into Q&A. What are some of the trends that you're seeing? And just looking at the future, how do you envision technology impacting clinical trials? Looking forward to a more of an endemic environment coming out of the pandemic later this year, keeping optimistic. Do you foresee technology continuing? What do you see the impact? And Lisa, you're nodding your head.
Personally, I think it's going to continue, and I think it's going to continue to evolve and change as we go through. And obviously, just look at computer games 10, 15 years ago. The evolution of those is just huge. I think the evolution of what we're using in clinical trials is massively changing at the moment. I think it's continued to evolve that way. One of the big things I think is going to have to change in the future is the way that ethics committees review this information, because at the moment, certainly the ones we're looking for are still sitting there with send us your traditional screenshots. Yeah. And the volume of pages that we're sending in now when they want a screenshot of every single thing is we're sending in kind of van loads of paper in half the time. Or massive amounts and volumes of disk space and everything else is taking a memory space. So I think that's going to have to change, and I think it might actually get to a point where one day we just say, look, we'll send you a phone with all of the apps on it. You sit there and you go and play with it for a day. And they've actually got it in their hands to go and play with. Just think about apps, for example, rather than sending, megabytes of actually screenshots and everything else, because I don't think the screenshots are particularly practical. And I think they're starting to realize that actually you can't really tell how something works when you've just got kind of a whole row of screenshots. So I think that's one of the big changes that's going to be coming up in the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Have you tried actually offering the phone to an ethics committee? Because this is such a good idea.
We haven't done yet, but it's something that we've certainly been discussing for future studies.
Yeah. It's actually, I don't want to say it's easy. You can share a link. You don't even need to even give them a phone, because they can, normally, especially just giving an example with Medocity, a link will allow anyone to log in as long as they have a login code, and then they can walk through the application and see how it's used. And we usually put a dummy patient, a mock study, that kind of thing, so they can actually visualize it. So you don't need to even give them the phone, just give them the link. But I think the idea is a good one. Yeah. Anyone else regarding trends and future in terms of using technology in clinical research? Paul?
I think transparency among stakeholders is going to continue to evolve, and I think that is true both. And I think the commercial side could almost take a page out of the book from the clinical side, where there's a lot closer connectivity. On the commercial side, there's less so. The pharmaceutical end-to-end supply chain is very siloed. And there is a growing degree of collaboration, but I think that collaboration and connectivity on the clinical side is going to continue to evolve and mature. And I think that could carry over into the mainstream pharmaceutical space as well. And that's a trend that we're kind of betting on and we're investing in, but I think that it's also going to be more broadly accepted as time goes on. And, it's getting easier to share data. It's getting easier to share information. And I think that, patient engagement goes along with that. How do we bring the patient in closer? How do we establish other channels of communication with the patient, either whether it's a clinical trial or whether it's a direct-to-patient medication, home infusion, those kinds of things. What kind of communication and connectivity needs to be built in the background infrastructure to support those evolving trends.
Mm-hmm. Those are great points, Paul. And I want to say that in the, how many years I've been in pharma, on both sides, clinical and commercial, being able to see the two talking and the data, being brought together so that the insights can be utilized, and then, of course, benefiting, whether it's strategy for market or real-world evidence to benefit clinical trial design, would be, and it is happening, but to have one solution that has a platform that brings that all together is, I think, a key, a key source of that approach. Any last words in terms of future and trends, Christina or Rich, before we go to questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in. I think it's really extremely important that we bring the sites on board as well on the journey, because ultimately they really dictate what's going to happen, right? So they are the ones prescribing the technology to the patient. So it's extremely important that the site, that we co-create these digital platforms with them. So first, to the ones that are not too sure about technology, so bring them the benefits, and then not just come up with solutions and dump it, give them to them, oh, no, you have to use this. No, get them really involved in the development process. I think this is, for me, one of the things that are super important.
Yeah, so it's obviously the patient burden is important, but also the site burden. You want technology that's going to be not creating more work for the sites and the coordinators and the investigators, but making it easier. Yeah.
Yes, it won't work otherwise. It just simply won't work.
Richard?
Yeah, and I think that's a great, in fact, everyone has made some really great points, so I don't have a huge amount to add. I think the other thing that I think is really exciting is where this we've talked about digital devices in terms of measurement on trials, in terms of data collection, but obviously there's the whole digital therapeutics field in here as well, and software as a medical device, and I think the intersection between the two is going to be super exciting, and I suspect will really change the way we do trials. And I think, one of the interesting things I was thinking about when Christina was talking about the site burden is what the role of sites will be in future trials, and how much we will need them at all, and whether we potentially can be directly recruiting patients without need for sites in our trials at all. So I think there's going to be a lot of changes, and it's going to be an exciting ride, but I think there's a lot of things to solve on the way there.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. I'm very intrigued and very inspired by all the discussion we've had, and looking forward to the future, looking forward to more discussions and interactions. So thank you all very, very much. I'm going to pass over to Mark. I think we're in our Q&A time. I don't know if we have any questions, Mark. I haven't checked.
I don't see any questions in at the moment. I have suggested to the audience through the Discuss tab that they should drop any questions for the audience in the Q&A function. So please feel free to do that. Maybe give them a minute or so to drop them in there. If you look on the right-hand side, there's various tabs, one which is Q&A. Drop the question in there, we can view it, and then we can select it and answer it. So I don't know if you have any final question for the panel, Amy, at all, while we wait to see if any questions come through.
Well, I guess the only other thing was when we were talking about quality of data. I know for the most part, from what you were saying, Lisa, the data is very, very clean. But I've heard in other conversations that there seems to be a lot of noise that comes through from devices, and how do we deal with that? That might be the only other question I had, kind of listening to some of the responses.
I don't know if I have much to add. I think one of the things that's interesting about continuously collecting data is the fact that you can kind of spot some of the other things that are going on, right? When you get someone in the lab and you kind of we're doing this test, and now we're going to turn on the data collection and do the thing and turn it off again. You often miss the kind of context, right? And so one of the things that I think is an interesting opportunity is that with continuously collected data from devices, you can see a bit more of that context and see whether that data is, whether there might be some other explanation for why your data collection on this occasion was perhaps significantly different than other times you collected it. So I think there are certainly some things like that. I think, noise in the data is definitely an issue. And obviously, if you're collecting data while people are just going about their regular lives, then, there are lots of, unexpected things that could be cropping up and showing up in there that you just cannot control for. But I think the fact that you can collect so much is kind of what enables you to avoid that essentially the noise overwhelming your issue, right?
Right. Yeah.
More data with noise is still better than less data, even if it's got less noise in it as well.
Yeah, I know. To your point, Lisa, with all the quantity of data, I think that ended up being a lot of manual work to be able to clean that, but
it was, I guess, supporting what Richard was just saying is actually that noise behind it is part of what we were intentionally collecting. So we were actually looking to collect, their interactions, their sociability, their movements, and everything else. So to a lot of people, that would just be noise, but to us, that's the core data of what we're looking to collect.
Right.
So we were looking to collect all that, so we didn't have an issue with it at all. In fact, the more we had, the better.
Yeah. Paul, any additional thoughts?
Yeah, we're taking a slightly different perspective in that we're looking at data from a power efficiency standpoint. So data has a cost from a power standpoint, and we're very much focused on long life cycles. So we had to keep going back through our process to say exactly what data do we need to solve the use case. And if the data doesn't contribute to the solving of the use case, but it's interesting data that you want, for some other reason, don't collect it. Find another vehicle to collect that. And so we really had to filter out the nice to have or that would be interesting from this is necessary in order to solve the use case. So being selective about the data that you're collecting reduces noise. But, from a clinical standpoint, I think more is better. From, our standpoint, we're trying to be a little more efficient.
Exactly. Christina, any thoughts on from your side?
No. I have a quick question, though, to Richard, because you spoke about robotics, but do you have any actual experience with robots? And do you think this is something that the patients would welcome at home and would be useful for trials? Sorry, probably a little bit off topic, but I think if I have an expert, I'll ask him.
Most of my robotics work was underwater or in space, so not the kind of robots I worked on. But it has to be said, so there were some really interesting studies which have been done, for example, with robots in care homes. And actually the patients showed real preferences in some cases for dealing with the robots rather than with humans, because they didn't mind if the robot came in the morning and said, did you remember to take your pills this morning? They didn't have that sense of embarrassment that they did when a human asked them the same question. And so actually, devices and robots and kind of smart devices do I think have a role to play. I think that the care home people were also happy to lean on a robot, for assistance walking down a corridor, where again they would feel embarrassment having to lean on a human helper. So I think there's some interesting stuff in there about, our first assumption about what's good and what isn't may not actually be correct for patients in these kinds of situations. But so yes, not a great deal of experience, but I do think there are some really interesting questions, and potentially you could imagine thinking about those things as trial, as things that we should be running trials on, right? As interventions that we should test clinically.
Yeah.
Yeah, great discussion. Honestly, it's again very inspiring to move forward and look at technology and how it can benefit that of course patients, sites, sponsors, clinical leaders, and the commercial side as well. So I think we're out of time, and I want to thank you again. Look forward to hopefully running into you somewhere, who knows, in person, as opposed to just on the screen. and hopefully talking again. Thanks. And Mark, are we getting any questions? I think we have a question up there, or is that?
We have, it's more of a comment. So yeah, we have a comment, which is Greg has made a comment. Robots are widely used in physical medicine and rehabilitation.
I see.
It's just
absolutely true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But no, I think that brings the session to a close. So yeah, I mean, I've been sat in the audience and I've been listening, and it's great to see a bunch of very passionate people, clearly, and obviously a lot of experience. So I'm sure you could have continued the conversation and gone on for many hours more. But unfortunately, we are out of time. So I'd just like to say thank you. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the panelists, Christina, Lisa, Paul, and Richard, for sharing your insights. But of course, thank you very much to Amy as well for moderating the session. Another reminder, Medocity, Amy represents it. They are a sponsor. They've got a virtual exhibition area. So, there is still, the platform will remain open. So, go and meet with Amy and the team from Medocity. You can find out more, ask them direct questions. That's it really. So thanks again, Amy and the panelists. That brings the session to a close. And in fact, actually, it brings the event to a close as well. So I guess from a personal perspective, I've taken great pride in running the event today. We ran in a conference yesterday as well, the Digital Therapeutics event, and it's seen a lot of great insights being shared. There's been a lot of ground covered on some really insightful topics. So special thank you to everybody that's been part of it. Wouldn't be able to make the event happen without the speakers, the panelists, and the sponsors. So I hope to see you all again soon. Other than that, thank you very much.
Thank you. We hope to see you in the exhibit area.
Good evening.
Bye.
Take care.